Oh, you have mute?
Thank you for letting me know. All right, I apologize about that. Welcome to our session on a unique and innovative approach to postvention support with our speakers, Gally and Jeffrey. My name is Maddie, pronouns she, her. My job is to moderate this session and support participants and speakers. I posted my name in chat. Please look for chat and let me know if you can't find chat or need help with that feature. You will be able to chat to everybody or privately to one person. Are there any questions about that, or do you need help finding that? Nope. All right. One of the things we care about is safety of our participants. We ask people to be on camera if they can, because we do use visual cues to monitor your safety. If you can't be on camera, please let me know by saying so out loud or sending me a quick chat or saying BRB or bye. We care about you and we'll try to reach you if we do have any concerns about your safety. This session does touch on suicide and other topics that can be intense. If you find that you need support, you can always call the Lifeline even after the conference is over. I've posted the number in chat. You can also reach out to me individually, privately in chat, and we can chat back and forth. We also do have a drop-in support room available that is staffed here at the conference, and you can find that in chat as well. I posted that to everyone, and that can provide you with some one-on-one support. Finally, the conference center's lived experience, so we hope you will share your personal stories with each other. One of the things we ask is that when you do share, please stop and think about what is appropriate for the time and space. Please share in ways to communicate what happened without providing details or graphic information that others might find disturbing. Lastly, please save your questions for the end. Feel free to enter them in chat and we will follow up with them at the very end of the presentation. But don't worry, we'll go ahead and address that at the very end of the presentation after our speakers go through their information. Are there any questions in regards to that? All right, I'll let Gally and Jeffrey take the lead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning, and I'm super happy to have you join us. There are, looks like there's 23 of us in the room, so super happy to have you be a part of this conversation. My name is Gally Murray. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Suicide Prevention Coordinator for Clackamas County. I'm going to be joined today by Dr. Jeffrey Anderson, who is the supervisor of our crisis program in Clackamas County, and his team leads the efforts for the postvention that we're going to talk to you all about today. We have about 45 minutes together today, and we will be having questions at the end, so there'll be plenty of time for that. And let's get going. Next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Clackamas County, just to orient you to the lay of the land of Clackamas County. So we are part of the Portland metropolitan area and probably about 20 miles south of Portland proper. We are a pretty big county, the third most populous county in the state. And we have a really diverse makeup of, both frontier, rural, suburban, and urban communities. And so it makes our community, our county pretty diverse. Our suicide rate is 13.8, which is lower than both the national rate, which is, I believe, 19, excuse me, the national rate, which is 14.2, and the state rate, which is 19. Next slide, please. So Clackamas County did not have any formal standardized approach to postvention before Senate Bill 561 was passed in 2015. I'm sure some of you here on the call today know a lot about Senate Bill 561. If you are a Senate Bill 561 postvention designee, and some of you may not. So I'm going to briefly just kind of go through what Senate Bill 561 mandates every single one of the 36 counties in Oregon to do in a nutshell. So basically, the rules that came out in 2015 indicated that each county has to have a communication protocol around how we communicate about deaths and how we get support to the people who need it. The other purpose, I guess, of Senate Bill 561 was to reduce contagion, and by doing that, we get postvention supports to the people who need it at the right time when they need it or want it. And another part of the Senate Bill 561 requirement was that the local mental health authorities have to report youth suicide deaths, and youth is now defined between 5 and 24. It used to be 10 to 24, to the Oregon Health Authority, to Jill Baker, who's on the call today here, within a certain time frame. And we report that information to her, and that's the data that she uses to better understand, what as a state how we're doing. Next slide, please. So Jeffrey's going to talk Jeffrey's going to talk in more detail about the specific pathway that Clackamas County uses to get postvention support to the people who need it and want it. But we work really, really closely with our medical examiner team. We are fortunate to have a medical examiner team comprised of 4 individuals. We have a deputy medical examiner and then 3 other medical examiners that work alongside her. I have to say, I remember when I first started this position, which was 6 years ago, and I made a cold call to the medical examiner's office saying, hey, I want to partner with you. If we put our heads together, we can figure out a way to reduce suicides in our community, because what we know is that people who experience a loss from suicide are then more at risk of suicide themselves. And she didn't need anyone to sell her on that idea. She was a champion from the get-go and is a huge, huge, huge fan of this work, and is a really a wonderful partner in this work. So the trick about Senate Bill 561 is that it is only statutorily requiring us to report on deaths 5 to 24 years old. And the medical examiner will, in the past couple of years, it's changed where her team actually notifies us through the Medical Legal Death Investigation Portal, or known as the MDI log. And essentially the MDI log is the database that I believe all medical examiners, Jill's nodding her head, all medical examiners use in the state of Oregon and probably elsewhere. But this is where basically the details of a death are covered, demographics, previous suicide attempts, family history, you name it. All of the things that I need to inform our postvention efforts are in that MDI log. Now, on occasion, sometimes there are circumstances where I will call the medical examiner and say, tell me a little bit about what you wrote in here. And there'll be some narrative information that isn't in that database that's really important for us to know. For example, situations where we had a young person many years ago where mom and dad were divorced, and mom and dad were literally arguing over the remains of this young man. And this young man was literally the disposition of his body was being literally argued about. And so when we did postvention, it was really important for Jeffrey's team to know that when we reached out to mom, when we reached out to dad, that there was this big tension going on. So we get a lot of really helpful information from the medical examiner's office, both in the MDI log and both just from phone calls and narratives along the way. Now, I mentioned that Senate Bill 561 is just for 5 to 24-year-old deaths. And because Clackamas County believes in this work, and because Jeffrey Anderson has a team of folks that are like a well-oiled machine in doing this work, we decided, well, why wouldn't we do this work across the lifespan? And so when we hear of a death, and once you go to the next slide, Jeffrey, when we hear of a death of any aged individual, we provide postvention support. So again, and the majority of the numbers that we provide, the majority of the postvention support that we provide is actually for deaths of individuals above the age of 25. So most of the postvention support that we provide to our community are for adult-related deaths. So again, the medical examiner is an amazing partner, but we also have an amazing amount of community support for doing this work. And so we have other folks that also alert us to deaths when they hear of them. So even though we may be notified in the MDI log, or I may be notified, or Jeffrey may be notified in the MDI log of a death, if it's a 24-year-old or below death, We have other community partners who will also alert me in my role as a suicide prevention coordinator to a death. And that includes law enforcement. We have a behavioral health unit, which is a group of mental health professionals and peer supports that are out with our law enforcement partners, providing support in our community. We have an amazing resource called Trauma Intervention Program, or TIP, in our community. Some of you may have TIP in your community. If you don't, I would love for you to talk with your community about bringing TIP there. TIP is an organization that is mostly volunteers, and they are dispatched through the 911 CCOM system. And they are deployed to a situation such as bad car accidents, car fatalities, shootings, massive traumatic events, and of course, suicides. And they are one of the very few supports that are involved at the scene of when the event has just occurred. And they are allowed, like underneath the yellow tape that may have been put up, and their job is solely to provide emotional first aid and psychological first aid to those who are bereaved or impacted at the scene. And ultimately, our medical examiner team and our law enforcement team can do their jobs that they need to do because folks like TIP are there taking care of the survivors and folks who have potentially been impacted and witnessed an event. So they also inform us, our county clinics and housing and social services in our community. We also have a policy at Clackamas County that is relatively new, that the 700 employees that are employed in the department that Jeffrey and I work are required by policy actually to alert the suicide prevention coordinator, and that is me in this role right now, that if there is a death or a suspected death of any aged individual in Clackamas County, not just someone who we have had a touch point with. So maybe it doesn't have to be someone who we served in our primary care clinics or our behavioral health clinics. Any death in Clackamas County, if they hear of a suspected death or a suicide death, the policy states that they are to alert me. And again, this isn't because we want to be nosy. This is because we want to make sure that we get postvention support to people who need it and deserve it, and who probably otherwise don't know that it exists and feels like they're all alone. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Anderson to speak to the pathway of how this works and the details of his team that provides this work, and go into the nitty-gritty. All right, Jeffrey, all yours.
Hey, thanks, Gally, and thanks for that great introduction to our program. So yeah, as Gally was saying, we have these partners who are providing us with information, and the sole reason is to do postvention. So this is something that all of you already know, but when someone dies by suicide, many, many people are impacted. People used to talk about 6 people for some reason. 6 people are going to be impacted by suicide, by each suicide. And we know that it's much more. In a lot of cases, we've got family, friends, coworkers, classmates, teachers, others who were close or even not that close to the person who's died. A 2018 study put the number of people affected by one death by suicide at 135, which seems incredible, but I can absolutely see that being possible. So up to 135. They talked about how, varying levels of affectedness, much like, in the Connect model, we talk about the ecological model, where you have varying rings of affectedness, from very close family and friends to folks who were perhaps on the periphery of the person's life, but still affected, still potentially grieving, upset, and also potentially at risk. Others have called this the ripple effect. So this is why it's obviously so important that we provide this postvention to reduce their risk, among other things. So we know that survivors of suicide loss, or those who've lost someone to suicide, potentially go through a complex set of emotions and experiences. A study by Tal Young and their colleagues describes these experiences, and I'm actually going to quote from their study here. Feelings of loss, sadness, and loneliness experienced after any death of a loved one are often magnified in suicide survivors by feelings of guilt, confusion, rejection, shame, anger, and trauma. Furthermore, survivors of suicide loss are at higher risk of developing major depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal behaviors, as well as a prolonged form of grief called complicated grief. Added to the burden is the substantial stigma, which can help or can keep survivors away from much needed support and healing resources. Thus, survivors may require unique supportive measures and targeted treatment to cope with their loss. And before I go on, it's important to note people can go through a lot of experiences, a lot of feelings, and be at risk for a lot of things. This isn't to say that every loss survivor is going to go through these exact feelings. I think the researchers were just sort of saying these are a lot of the potential possibilities. So given all this, in our own community, in order to provide the level of support that we think is crucial for survivors of suicide loss, we set up a standardized system, like Gally said, and we follow this every time without fail. We made it simple, we involved as few people as possible, and in fact, we also limit the number of folks who hear about a suicide death or even read about that death so as to limit the vicarious trauma among our providers. So prior to this program, we definitely did provide postvention support prior to 2015. We just didn't have a strategy, and it was sort of haphazard and piecemeal at best. So it starts with what Gally talked about, the medical examiner, or another one of our partners like law enforcement, or the trauma intervention program in Portland, or someone who's learned about a death by suicide are asked, they inform Gally really when they learn about these deaths. Gally gathers information and contacts me. I ask my team whether anyone can provide postvention. One of them inevitably emails me back with a yes, and actually emails the whole team so everyone knows. And then I email that one person with the information that they'll need to provide this postvention. And over the course of the next hour or two, or perhaps more time, they start their postvention work. So backing up, when Gally contacts me, she's gathered up some specific information, the name, the date of their death, who are the folks that we're reaching out to, what's their contact info, other important details like basically what happened. When should we reach out? That's another important question. Also, and this is crucial, how do family and others view this death? So sometimes folks aren't in agreement with the medical examiner, and this is really important for us to know about and to respect. Our job isn't to tell loss survivors what happened or to be some kind of reality check for them. Our job is to provide support after a tragedy, and that's how we're going to handle it. So how this information is shared and with whom is also a significant consideration. When we developed our workflow, we wanted to keep a few things in mind. So first, exposure to tragic stories and situations can lead to secondary traumatic stress for our staff. Even knowing that there's call for a postvention, which by default means that there's been a death in our community, this information can be very tough on staff. As many of you probably know, this kind of stress can lead to compassion fatigue and burnout. But it also can change the way that we as providers view and make sense of the world in a negative way. So by sharing the minimum necessary information with only the staff member who's actually going to be following up with the person, we hope to protect our staff from secondary trauma. Second, and just as important, we want to respect the confidentiality for the decedent. Folks who have died by suicide still have the right to confidentiality, so we limit who hears about their story. And then third, of course, we also need to preserve privacy for their loved ones. So our team is comprised of Clackamas County Crisis Line and walk-in clinic staff, so employees who are responsible for our safety net, who we've tapped for this work as well. It's important to note that this postvention work is not funded per se. We just carve out the time from our crisis team. And for those of you who have worked on crisis teams, you know that certain days this is totally fine, and other days it kind of makes it more difficult. So after I've asked for postvention support, I usually hear from the 4 or so staff who are responsible for this work within a couple of hours. As I mentioned earlier, the postvention isn't assigned, but instead postvention team members choose whether they can do it today. So they make this decision based on their workload, but also on how they're doing, how much emotional content they can handle at this moment. We're usually going to provide the service same day unless Gally gives us a reason not to. Some folks, for instance, maybe law enforcement has told them you might get a call from Clackamas County, and they tell law enforcement, can you have them call next week? I don't want to hear from them this week, or maybe call in a couple weeks. The staff who do this are highly trained, not only in suicide prevention and safety planning, but motivational interviewing, coping skills, CBT, DBT. They've been trained in, some special risk formulation. They also, a few of them have been Connect trained, so that sort of thing. Geographic boundaries don't bother us. So we provided postvention support to survivors in Asia, in Australia, in other places outside of our county. Asia and Australia just happen to be the most exotic, but we learn about a death and we're going to follow up. We've also reached out to folks where the death wasn't a suicide, but it was a tragic, sudden death, unexpected, and we were asked to outreach. So none of these boundaries really matter to us. We let people know that our postvention services are available at any point in the future. So we've had folks call a year and a half later, and that's just fine. Again, we just want the barriers to be as low as possible for survivors. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the phone call. We start with a phone call, we introduce ourselves, mention that we're calling to offer support after the death of their loved one. Again, we aren't going to necessarily call it a suicide at that moment. We're going to call it a death. There's nothing, we're not worried about calling it a suicide. Again, it's just sometimes we need the family to lead us in this conversation. There's a brief introduction that each clinician does differently. And then, like I said, the conversation develops based on what the survivor needs. These outreach calls can be to a place of employment, to speak with a manager, a church community, to speak with the leader there, a school setting, you name it. We've even been involved in providing support to counselors and case managers and other providers within our county health system when they've been identified as folks who might need support. So we do screen for suicide. This is a crucial goal of the call. Many others during the last 2 days have talked about the fact that loss survivors can be at risk for suicide themselves. We're also going to find out what resources they may need while determining if there are already some supports that they take part in or could use help reconnecting to. At some point, we always explore whether therapy or counseling would be helpful. Maybe not at this time, but again, we broach that subject if they're not engaged with a provider. I'm going to say that the majority of folks that we talk to say they're not necessarily ready to sit down right now. And that's absolutely fine. Or they've already got a counselor and they're going to be making an appointment. But we offer this counseling, in this case for free, at our walk-in clinic without billing insurance and without any regard to coverage. We also want to highlight that other services could be useful, like peer support. We have a number of peers at our clinic who can provide support to survivors. Overall, we're just trying to prevent bigger problems down the line and to support the grief process. These calls can range from very short. Sometimes they're just 5 minutes and the person's like, a lot of stuff that's going on right now. Can you call me next week? Or whatever it is. Sometimes these calls can last an awful long time. The outreach call, let's see here. And speaking of time, okay, great. We might start with 1 or 2 loss survivors identified by our partners in the community, but we always ask, is there anyone else who could use postvention support? Are there folks that we don't know about? And because remember, we're talking about often many more people than we initially realize, we are trying to reach as many of them as possible. So to mitigate secondary trauma and also to remain consistent, in almost every case, the same clinician will be doing the outreach to multiple survivors, finding out, is there another person to call? What's their number, et cetera. We've had an outreach start with 1 person only to wind up actually outreaching to 25 folks. Another highlight from these calls is that we'll find out if they would like a callback on any anniversary dates. This can be really important. So we help them decide whether a birthday, potential graduation date, yearbook release, or other important dates in their life might be harder than other days. And do they want a call on that day? And we just make sure that that happens from the same clinician. After the calls are made, we do document in our electronic record. We are a health clinic, so we kind of have to document our work. But the main reason or the function is so that if the individual calls back, they're actually calling back to our crisis line, particularly if they want that therapy service later. Anyone who takes the call needs to be able to see that, oh, this was a postvention person. We're going to bring them in for free services. We also need a record of the call for any of those future outreach efforts. Now, the agreement that staff has made is that they'll check in with someone at some point after they've provided the postvention. So a supervisor, that's me, peers, somebody who can provide support. We recognize that this work is really hard, and it may be harder than what the average county mental health worker is being asked to do. So taking care of our people is absolutely crucial. So we almost always send a follow-up letter. This was developed by our staff after they'd had some experience of providing postvention. It's just a template, so they change it up where they need it. In this case, they'd probably change the first paragraph to reflect the specific situation or story. We send this letter only if we've talked about it on the call and if the person wants it. It's really useful for folks who just don't know what their next steps are with regard to us. And they're not really asking for a callback anytime soon. So this just gives them the information, maybe when they can process it better. The letter also stresses that services will be available to them at any time in the future, should they feel the need to engage. So data, we've been at this for 5 years now. As you can see, this is just one employee's efforts, but the service has grown over time as more partners learn about what we're doing, and they're in turn telling us about deaths by suicide. You can see how we peaked in terms of calls made in 2019. Data collection has been made really difficult by our electronic health record, I will say, it's basically made for an outpatient clinic rather than a call center. We have recently made some overhauls, and so I'm hoping that I can have better data about calls in the future. Having said that, I do have better data about the clinic services. So when folks agree to come in for the free counseling, these data show efforts of the entire Postvention team, but they only go back to 2018 when we actually started collecting in September of that year. You can see that the number of loss survivors who were seen, how many total services. The average length of treatment is about 3 to 4 months. The longest that we've treated someone so far is about 7 months at this point. And, being a crisis clinic, we're not necessarily set up for that, but we've made the commitment that some folks really need this support for longer than we would typically see folks. We typically see folks for 30 days at our crisis clinic. So, but staff have found this really to be rewarding as well, providing this type of support to survivors. Now, in terms of anecdotal data, we have a lot more. We have some lessons learned there. The number one thing is how appreciative and surprised people are when we call them initially. That's almost everybody says, wow, I just didn't know that this existed. And then as we talk about the free services, that's people are surprised. We've also deduced that 7 to 10 days after the death seems to be an okay time to contact survivors. Any sooner, and like I said earlier, often folks don't know what they want or how to use our support. As you can imagine, or perhaps have experienced, loss survivors are somewhat in shock sometimes and often aren't able to tell us how we can help. So having one person be the contact has been important. So we've learned that over time. Another lesson is that the counseling and support we provide has to be different because the grief our postvention clients are experiencing is different from other grief and loss. Staff have recently recommended maybe we get some additional training in additional modalities. So we're going to be looking into that. gaps. So all along we've been noting different gaps. So one is that our outreach is really important, and yet many loss survivors have said, if you had not called, there's no way I would have called you. So even if they'd known about our program, they say they just wouldn't have ventured that call. This is consistent with some of what we've know about loss survivors' hesitancy sometimes to reach out in general, but we hope to promote this program more through our website and through social media. We also recognize that there's a real need for specialty case management related to the suicide deaths. So what other resources are available? Can I get help with my rent, new furniture, funeral costs, that sort of thing? So we plan on looking at how to devote some case manager time to this program. But again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a funded program. So it's one of those things that we constantly sort of have to just have people doing double duty, really. And finally, we still don't hear about every suicide death. That's something Gally and I talk about all the time. When we get the numbers at the end of the year and then we compare that to the deaths that we heard about. So we're trying to fix that. Information sharing between our ME's office and other parts of the county has been a complicated business, but we're focusing on it so that someday we'll be able to offer this in every situation where it may be necessary or helpful. And lastly, here's something one of our postvention staff told me recently, and it gives me so much hope. I think it sums up their work really well. Even if I don't have the answer to a grieving person's biggest questions or worries or concerns, just being there for them as many times as needed can significantly decrease their guilt, their trauma, and their risk for suicide. I really like this statement because it's as important as it is for our staff to be highly trained and to have the right therapeutic skills. It just reminds us that this is a human connection, and that just being there for someone can make such a huge difference. So Gally and I want to thank you so much for your attendance today. Here's our contact information, and we also did have our slides uploaded to the website for anybody who's interested. And now I think we've hopefully got some time for questions.
Oh, I have been collecting some of the questions. The first one is from Deanna. Do you have a script when you reach out to loss survivors, especially when the family might not agree or have to come to terms with the suicide or death? I'll go ahead and put that in the chat again.
Thank you. We don't have a script per se. The staff who do this all sit in basically this little cubicle area. So they definitely sometimes exchange ideas about how to approach calls. So, one might say, I've been doing it with this kind of verbiage, but I don't think we've developed a script for them. We developed that letter because it just made it easier. You didn't have to start from scratch every time. But at this point, we don't have a script for them.
All right, my next one is, does the Postvention team ever provide support in a group setting if requested by the family, friends, colleagues, etc., or just to individuals?
We could do that for sure. Yeah, all of my staff have some group training from their previous lives. We don't do groups at the clinic, but we basically, we've been super open to anything. We're fortunate that the agency that I work for is very open about this kind of stuff. And basically, if you can make it happen, make it happen. So yeah, I would say we would.
All right, another one is, including peer-to-peer support, does Postvention services also provide services via virtual tools like Zoom?
For sure, yeah. I mean, especially over the last year and a half. I think mostly anything that we do where somebody wants to actually get the counseling service, mostly it's been through Zoom. I think maybe one person has been coming physically into the clinic. Yeah.
All right, one from Caroline. I'm curious what level of supervision support is provided to TIP volunteers.
So I'm the supervisor. So I do clinical supervision with each of my staff for at least an hour a month. But as anyone who has worked in the clinic knows, my door is always open. And so folks just, I mean, they literally, just come to the office, knock on the door, and we sit down and talk. So definitely for those who provide postvention supports, that the quality of that has sometimes been different because there's again, that vicarious trauma and just some of the feelings that come up when you're talking to somebody about death. So yeah, there's plenty of that. And then they are really good. They provide really good peer support to each other as well.
And I will add too, as far as the TIP volunteers go, yeah, so TIP is not part of Clackamas County's program. So Jeffrey's team and TIP are two separate entities, but we just work very much in conjunction with them. And the training that the TIP volunteers get is just it's significant. They go through 40 hours of training before they're able to be deployed into the community. And that training is psychological first aid. That training, the medical examiner comes and speaks to them about what they can expect on scene. They go through, they go through a lot of training. I joke as a Clackamas County employee of nearly 20 years, I joke that they probably got more training than I ever got as a county employee before I started doing the work. So yeah, they take training really seriously. And one of the things that they do really well is that, similar to Jeffrey's program, that they are expected after they clear a call, someone calls them and for a debriefing session. And that person was not on the call with them. So they call and check in about how was it. And it gives people an opportunity to talk about the things that they couldn't put in the database that collects the information. So they can talk about the emotional aspect of their response.
And I want to add on to the back end of that. Actually, another way that TIP and my program have been connected is that we've actually had the person who started TIP, June Vining, come over and do some work with my postvention staff. So she's provided all sorts of advice and just like really great self-care techniques for my staff. So that's been a great partnership for us.
All right. Yoshiki just put another question about funding. What is the relationship with the insurance company regarding the cost of postvention services?
That is a great question. We do not charge anyone for postvention services. So we literally, we bypass our entire billing system when we do these services. No one gets a bill. So insurance isn't billed, the client isn't billed. We just eat the cost as part of our mission. And, we just carve out that time from already funded positions. So.
Yeah, I'll say to that, just to emphasize, I think Jeffrey's being pretty humble, that, it is the only service that the urgent mental health walk-in clinic, only clinical service that the urgent mental health walk-in clinic provides that is at no cost and no barrier, really. So his team has worked really hard to remove any barriers at all for folks getting support, which is why insurance and household income doesn't matter.
Yeah.
All right, I have a question. Has the team provided postvention support to non-English speaking folks? And if so, how does the interpreter role affect the work?
We have provided it to folks who speak Spanish, and we have a Spanish provider. So we have someone who speaks Spanish in the clinic who can do postvention work. I think we did use an interpreter for someone when we did talk to somebody in China. And I mean, basically we use a phone service and they often do very well. I mean, they're folks who are somewhat trained in just working with folks around health. Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, the call went well. So.
All right. What makes this possible in Clackamas? Driver individuals, infrastructure. How can this be replicated in other counties?
I'm happy to take that one.
Okay.
I think the biggest thing that makes it work in Clackamas County is that people believe in the work. All the way from the medical examiner to Jeffrey, who's been, he was the one who said, let's just do this. And the team of folks that he supervises that provide this work. All of us have this very kind of just integral communication of how the pathway works. And it really does start with the medical examiner. And so other than that, it really is about creating pathways, standardizing the work. And it really, quite frankly, it other than time, it hasn't really taken a lot to lift this program. It takes time, but the effort that is provided is just so valuable to our community. So, Jeffrey has already alluded to this, but if he and I can help in any way to help you all launch a program in your respective community, we'd be happy to help you. It really does help that this program is offered out of the urgent mental health walk-in clinic. It would be very hard. It would be harder to replicate this program if we didn't operate our own crisis line. We don't contract that out, and we provide our own county urgent mental health walk-in center. We don't contract that out, so it's easier.
All right, Abby, you have a question?
I do. Thank you. It's more of a comment, which is why I didn't put it in the chat. Gally, when you opened today, I just want to call out something that I think is so helpful to the smaller counties. I'm here in Klamath County, chair of our local coalition working at Klamath Basin Behavioral Health. And when you cold called the medical examiner, it's just relationships. Like, so much of this work just comes down to relationships. And in Southern Oregon, we often look up toward the I-5 corridor and think, well, we could never do that because we're not that big and we don't have that kind of infrastructure and we don't have those kind of resources. And so for you to start this position and then just call the medical examiner, and then that really seems to have unlocked just the power of the postvention work that you're doing, because Gally called somebody and said, let's do this work together. So I just want to call out that that's a really inspirational thing for some of the smaller counties with less resources. And then I would love to hear the answer to Jill's work of how you protect yourself, because prevention is so hard, because you don't get to know when you win, but you always get to know when you fail. Not that it's a failure, but you always know when you lose that particular one. And so to be that point of contact and just have that constant barrage. So, this work is hard. Everybody at this conference knows that. So I would love to hear how you take care of yourself, how you shield from all that.
Thanks for the call out about the relationships. It is so important. And that goes to like my relationship with Jeffrey too. It's like he was willing, like when I came to him and said, hey, what if we did this thing? He was like, okay, let's do it. And then it just happened. So, and as far as my role, I end up debriefing sometimes with Jeffrey. And then I actually use TIP. I use June Vining, who is the director of our local TIP. TIP has 2 paid staff out of hundreds of volunteers. June is the leader. And because she and her team are typically on at these suicides that her team responds to, I can call her and talk with her about the impact and the details, because she knows all those things and it's not breaking confidentiality, and I'm not traumatizing someone else. It's hard because, it's hard. I don't want to bring it home to my partner. I don't want to bring it home to, and I don't want to traumatize anybody else that doesn't know the details, because they don't need to know that information. So it's really intentional, and I reach out to folks that know the details. It's a struggle though. I don't always do a very good job of it.
I will just say that we also, our staff, in supervision each month, we always talk about self-care. The supervision that I do is, it's basically trauma-informed care informed. So we got some training from Trauma Informed Oregon around how to support our staff with the difficult work that they do. And TIO did an amazing job of creating a training for us that is basically supervision for trauma-informed care programs. So I would encourage people to check that kind of thing out as well. It's made us so intentional about these check-ins and about supervision. That's not just clinical, it's also how are you taking care of yourself? Let's develop a self-care strategy, that kind of thing.
It looks like we're out of time. So I just wanted to kind of conclude. It looks like, thank you, Gally and Jeffrey, for putting your contact information up. I really appreciate your time today. And if you guys have any questions, concerns, you can feel free to message me. I'm going to go ahead and put in my contact information below as well in chat. Again, thank you. You guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Take care.